Hey, it's Brett. Thank you for joining me on my first episode of Behind the Stack. I am really excited to introduce for my first episode author Shannon Bowring, whose new book, Where the Forest Meets the River, is out today. She is also the author of The Road to Dalton, the first installment of the Dalton, Maine books. A little bit about Shannon. Her work has appeared in numerous journals and has been nominated for Pushcart and Best of the Net prizes. She's been recognized on such short and long lists as the Maine Literary Awards and the Writer's Digest Short Story Competition. Her debut novel, The Road to Dalton, was included in the June 2023 Indie Next list and chosen as one of NPR's books we love in 2023. Shannon earned her MFA in creative writing from Stone Coast at the University of Maine. Raised in northern Maine, she now resides in the mid-coast region of the state where she works at her local library. And the new book has also been listed as one of Oprah's 28 books to read this fall. So thanks for being here and enjoy this interview with Shannon Bowring. I'm just thrilled you're here. You are actually my first guest.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm really kind of thrilled that it's you because I loved the books so much. And I was saying I was actually really glad that I hadn't read Dalton when it first came out, because if I read that and not known that something else was coming, I would have been fine. But knowing that there was something else coming, I was so great to be able to go right into part two.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I'm glad that that worked out.
Yeah, exactly. How is the weather there today?
It is very dreary and gray right now. And I apologize, all the clocks. My husband fixes clocks, so we have a lot
Oh,
of
he does?
yes.
Cuckoo clocks?
No, we don't have any cuckoo clocks, but we have all the other kinds you could imagine. So at the top of the hour, it gets a little loud.
That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. Do you have like a wall of clocks?
Um, we have clocks in every room of the house. So that one you just heard was the one on my bookshelf across the room, and there's
Okay.
one in the adjoining room. There's a couple in the living room. There's clocks everywhere.
You're never going to be in want of knowing what time it is.
Exactly. Yeah,
But does it also, they don't go all night though, do they?
they
The
do.
chime?
They do. We've gotten used to them at this point. It's like living near like a train track. You just eventually just you don't
It's like
notice.
it's white noise for you guys.
Yeah, it is. Just the constant ticking of time.
That's so funny. And you have to warn guests when they come. You're like,
We
just
do.
so you know,
Yeah.
you have to bring really sturdy earmuffs
Yeah.
or earplugs or like the sound of clocks.
Yeah. I mean, we typically will stop it for extra people, but
Yeah, exactly. Guests are coming, unplug everything.
yeah, yeah.
That's that is hilarious. Okay, so we're gonna get into the book
Okay.
in a second, but I want to go into I want to go generally a little bit. I want to talk about just Maine
Yes.
generally.
Yep.
Because you are a lifelong Mainer,
Yes.
correct? And I've always been so fascinated with Maine. I mean, my husband and I 2 years ago were there, and we ended up making an offer on a house
Oh
in Kennebunk.
my. Hmm.
And um, it was this great ship captain's home.
Oh yeah.
And this was the crazy thing about it is it had a 1,300 square foot library in the basement, and the
Oh.
house came with all the books. It was an elderly couple, and he was a bibliophile and collected all these books. He passed away. She didn't want to deal with any of them. And then this guy who's a big designer came and redid the entire house and was selling the house as is. But I remember walking down the first time, and it was larger than a lot of independent bookstores. Like crazy. And I thought to myself, okay, well, if we come here, I have this thing, but I literally could just end up with like the biggest Pango bookshop in the world because we pulled out of it only because it was too early to do this. Like my kids are still in school. I have a daughter who's a senior this year, and it was just like living in California, going there, like it seemed like a lot.
Yeah.
But I am so smitten with Maine. And as I know so many people are, but I'm really fascinated. Now, if I script this pronunciation, tell me, you grew up in Aroostook?
A
Is
rustic.
a Roostic, thank
A
you,
rustic. Yep.
which is what you're basing Dalton on,
My
correct?
I'm basing Dalton on my little hometown in Aroostook County.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I looked it up and it's much larger than I anticipated it
It's
being, but
huge.
it's, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, but this small town life,
Mhm.
I find this fascinating as well. But here's the one thing I want to ask you about Maine, and it comes up, I know, in the first book a little bit with one of the characters.
Yep.
This idea about being lifelong Mainers versus people that come into it later,
From away.
and the
Yeah.
yes, from away. And explain that to me, and the attitude that a lot of Mainers have towards the away people.
Oh, well, that's a very complicated thing to try to dissect. And I don't want to speak for every Mainer. Obviously, we all
Yeah,
have
sure.
slightly different opinions, but the general idea is you're from away if your family wasn't born in Maine generations ago. So
Okay.
like the summer tourists who come up for a few months, they're from away. Um, Say that you and your husband had bought your house and you had moved to Kennybunk, you would be from away.
Sure, sure, sure.
And no, wherever you are in Maine, it's a little bit different. So I live here on the coast now. I live in Bath, which is,
Hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
we're pretty used to people from away because it's a more diverse population. But when I was growing up in Aroostook, which is the northernmost county of Maine, and as you mentioned, it's a huge county. It's like the biggest area in Maine. But from when you're living there, people from away are any it's anyone like who lives south of Bangor, which is about in
Oh,
central Maine.
wow.
So you get like these pockets of Maine where from away is northern Mainers, sometimes see southern Mainers as an extension of Massachusetts from away. It's a very nuanced, complicated thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's open to individual interpretation in
Yes,
a
it
way.
is. There's a lot to unpack. Yeah.
And also you're so close, you're right on the edge of Canada
Yes.
as
Yeah.
well. It's funny because when I was looking it up last night and I was talking to my husband and he said, "Oh yeah," he said that whole northern tip. He
Yeah.
said the Canadians say that's the dagger that sticks into the heart of Canada.
I love that. Yeah. It's a yeah.
um, yeah, but it's the whole perception of Maine and how Mainers see outsiders is because you talk about it in this book. Elizabeth Strout speaks about it in her
Mhm.
books.
Yep.
So, and I should say that getting to the book, speaking of Elizabeth Strout, those comparisons I know have been made with your books, and it's very apt because, like her, you've created such a beautiful ensemble of characters, and they're so well crafted, and these characters that you really, really grow to love and care about and feel like they are so familiar. It's a really wonderful thing.
Thank you very much. I Every time I hear that comparison, it's just like it's a dream for me because Olive Kittredge was a huge inspiration for The Road to Dalton and I mean for all of my work, but that's just such an honor to be held in the same light as her. So thank you.
No, of course. I love that the books almost feel serialized in a
Yes.
way. And you know, it there's not a ton of books like this. Like, you know, I thought of right away, I thought of like Armistead Maupin's Tales of the
Hmm.
City did that kind of thing.
Yep.
And also a little bit of, I don't know if you've ever read the Alexander McCall Smith's the 44 Scotland Street series,
I have
which
not read
takes,
that.
okay, well, it's
Yeah.
similar. It takes a whole group of people in this little uh, apartment and 44 Scotland Street. It centers
Hmm.
around this one kid named Bertie, but
I love
again,
that.
it's the same thing. And so it's just such a heartwarming thing to go back and be with these people and sit with them.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a great genre. So Winesburg, Ohio is very much like that, and that's another huge inspiration. And I don't know if you've read Edward P. Jones' Lost in the City. It's kind of a
no,
collection of stories set in Washington D.C. in black neighborhoods in Washington D.C. And that's it. Kind of has that same feeling where you're just kind of you're in this one familiar neighborhood or community, and you're just dipping in and out to a bunch of different people's lives. I love
Yeah.
to like imagine in one small place you have countless stories that you can explore.
Yeah. No, it's
Yeah.
great. Okay, so for our listeners and viewers, can you tell a little bit about this latest installment, Where the Forest Meets the River?
Yes. So Where the Forest Meets the River is it I call it a sequel, but really it's a follow-up because it can stand alone or you can read it, as book 2 or
Hmm.
whenever you want. I've kind of created Dalton where you can stop in whenever you want to and you should feel comfortable there whether you've read the first one or not. But Where the Forest Meets the River takes place 5 years after the events in the first book. So we're in 1995, and there's a big sad thing that happens in the first book. I won't say what it is because I don't want to give too many spoilers away for people who haven't read it. But in the follow up, we're just kind of touching base with all of the same characters. We're seeing how they're coping with this sad thing that's happened, and you just get a glimpse of all these different people's lives in this small community in northern Maine. And some more drama happens. There's some secrets. There's, teenagers trying to understand who they are and who they want to be. It's just a slice of life. There's a lot going on,
Yeah,
but there is anywhere in real life. So
yeah, it's interesting. I felt the first book for me was about dealt with a lot with secrets and
definitely.
ultimately loss,
Yep.
where this latest installment
That's good.
feels
Good one.
very much about endurance
Yes.
and moving forward.
Yeah. That's how it felt writing it too. Writing the first one was very heavy at times. There's a lot of serious topics on mental health and sexuality. And in the second book, we're still dealing with those things, but there was a feeling when I was writing it that things were not necessarily lighter, but trending in a more hopeful direction. So it was a little bit easier to write emotionally the second book.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Well, in a weird way, it's almost like moving through the stages of grief. Do you know what I
Yes,
mean?
very much so. Yep. And I had that in mind as I was writing it.
And this feels closer to acceptance and seeing how it kind of plays out with so many of these characters. Can you talk a little bit about, because it's obviously very close to you, kind of the joys and pitfalls of small town life?
Well, I think the joys are just knowing all your neighbors, knowing that if you get a flat tire, they're going to come help you out. Just a sense of history there, growing up in the small town where I did, the people who taught me taught my mother. And so
Mm,
it was really nice to have that continuity. Like people knew my family and they understood who we were. But it could be said that the pitfalls are the same things, that everybody knows you and your history. So it's very much it's interesting that the good things can also be the bad things.
mm.
But personally, my favorite things about the town were that I grew up was that sense of people knowing me. But I love the landscape more than anything else
Ah.
because northern Maine is mostly trees, which is true. But I love trees. And so I just grew up surrounded by my hometown was in this little valley, and there
Mhm.
was a river that kind of ran through the one side of town. And if you were up on the hill in the middle of town, you could see in all directions. You could see all of the forest, the North Main woods. You could see all the farming fields that were around the area, and you could see way off to Mount Katahdin, which is the highest, well, really the only real mountain in Maine, but it's a big one. We love it. And so on a clear day, you could see all the way to that. And just that sense of feeling kind of literally on top of the world because it is the top of Maine. I was just so enamored with the landscape. And so I feel like not living there anymore, that's what I miss most about it, is that sense of openness. I feel like, yeah, I miss that.
Do you go back?
I go back to visit from time to time. It gets harder as I get older, and it's become a very complicated, complex thing with these books because even though I feel completely at home in Dalton, I don't always feel completely at home in my actual hometown. Because for me, Dalton has kind of become its own world. It was originally inspired by my hometown, but now it's kind of its own universe. And so going back and understanding that people who live there still see Dalton as their town, it's a little bit weird. It's kind of like straddling a few different worlds at one time.
Is it that you've created, do you think, the best version of that town for you?
I think so. And I think Dalton is not perfect. Dalton has a lot of issues to work out, but it does feel, I don't know, it feels different than my hometown did in a way. And maybe, I think part of that is just, the fictionalization of anything.
I wanted to talk about, we have a new character
Hmm.
that comes in this, named Vera, who's
Yeah.
great,
Yep.
who I'd love for you to talk a little bit about her. But then I have questions that relate to what we're just talking
Yeah.
about. But tell us a little bit, because she is new. So tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
Vera.
So Vera Curtis was not in the first book. She's in the second book. She grew up in Dalton and she moved away to the big city of Bangor, which anyone who is even remotely familiar will understand that Bangor is not really a big city. But growing up in the county, it's a destination. And
And it's
so,
also the home of Stephen King, which I
yes,
think
it
many,
is. That's
yes, so
right.
many, that's what I always knew it for.
Yep. But so she's moved down there. She's really independent. She works as a nurse practitioner. She's developed this life for herself beyond her hometown. Um, but right at the beginning of the second book, her aging mother falls and hurts herself, and so she has to go home and help take care of her parents, who are also new characters, and I absolutely loved writing them because they're
Mm.
just so complacent and content with who they are and what they have. And Vera, spent most of her life kind of feeling sorry for them in a way, thinking, my parents haven't seen the world, they don't know anything. But now she's come back as a 35-year-old and she's starting to see this town in a new light. And so she's beginning to understand why her parents love this town so much, because she missed, like me, she misses the topography of the county. She misses that feeling of being surrounded by nature, and things are quieter there, and it's a different pace than the big city of Bangor. And so, throughout the book, you're just seeing her try to understand what is home. Can my definition of home change as I change and evolve?
Yeah. So this is, it brought up questions about, with all this in mind, what you just said, do you think it's harder to leave a place you've always been, or harder to return to it after so many years?
Oh God, I think that's a tricky one. I don't know. Both of them have their complications. um, I think for me personally, it would be harder to go back to that hometown to
Mm,
live permanently.
yeah.
I feel like because I have become so much of a different person than I was when I grew up there that it would be really hard to bring all of my new life into that old life. It would feel a little bit disjointed.
Growing up, did you have a sense of wanderlust about you? Were you interested in exploring and seeing what was out there?
So that's another tricky one because so I was born with two really serious heart conditions. And so I
Okay.
was like the day I was born, I was flown off to the major hospital down in Portland, and
Wow.
my first 6 years I was undergoing lots of surgeries and procedures, including two open heart surgeries. So for the first 6 years of my life, I couldn't go anywhere. Like even when I was at home, I had to stay at home. I couldn't go hang
Mm,
out with other kids because of my immune system. So the way that I satisfied my wanderlust was through books. And so, you know, I had to sit at home, although I actually did like sitting at home, and I'm still a homebody to this day. But I didn't know that there was a world beyond my hometown unless I
mm.
was reading books. It probably wasn't until I was a teenager that I really started feeling like I wanted to see a lot more of the world. beyond the page, like to actually go
Sure.
to new places and travel and explore. But I've always kind of been torn between my introverted desire to just be at home with my cat and my husband, and my more curious nature where I would like to go and see new things and meet new people and experience different ways of living. So I'm always a little bit caught in between.
Have Have you gone to Europe? Have you been out of the country?
Yes, we did one of the Rhine River cruises a few years ago.
Oh,
It
how
was
was that?
beautiful, wonderful. Um, there's an age gap between me and my husband, and so I felt like everyone's granddaughter. It was pretty nice. Because it caters to an older crowd. Um, it was lovely, but it wasn't. You kind of just dip in and out of these places. Like you're
Yeah.
just another tourist. I've never gone and really like spent a significant amount of time in Europe. I would love to, but we've traveled around. We've been a few different places, but
With your fella.
with my fella. Yep,
I love that you call him your fella. I think that's so sweet and
that's what
endearing.
I've always called him, the fella.
I love that so much. Um, it's also cute because he's very tall.
He's very tall. He's
Yes.
he's 6'2". I'm barely 5 feet.
Yeah, I mean it's adorable seeing the two of you together because it's just
Thanks.
it's very, very cute. Now you've been married for 3 years, right?
Yep, you've been married for 3 years. We've been together almost 10 years.
Okay, okay. How much do you find of your own personal relationship bleeds at points into your characters?
Um, Definitely the most obvious one is in the first book. We have a character named Alice who's a writer who is married
Yeah.
to an older fella. And I understand that people think that I'm Alice. I don't see myself as Alice, but there's a lot of similarities there. But beyond that, I feel like a lot of my husband's personality comes through in Nate Thoreau, who's just
Oh yeah.
he's just such a decent, kind, tall man. And so I feel like,
He's like a moral compass of the book at times.
yeah, he is. That's what it feels like. So I feel like, in those parts, my life has trickled onto the page.
I love that. One of the most interesting relationships that exists in the book is, and I know you know probably what I'm going to say is between Trudy and Bev, and
Yeah,
I love Trudy so much,
I
and
love her
I
too.
really want to see a crossover because I feel like Trudy and Olive Kittredge would be best friends.
Oh my god! Or it would be the opposite, and they couldn't stand each other.
Yes, which would be like,
Yeah,
yeah, either way, or it would just be the Clash of the Titans kind
it
of
would.
thing. These
Yep.
two. And but I do, like, I was reading it, I was like, oh my god, she and Olive Kittredge together would be fireworks.
Yeah, it would be.
But it's such an interesting relationship, and I don't think this is spoilers because it comes out right in the
Yeah,
beginning of the first book, which is they're married, both women are married, but are having this kind of long going relationship with each other. So talk a little bit about that, how you came up with this, what made you think of this, also because I'm so interested in terms of um, there's so much talk in the book about there is the issues of sexuality that comes up with. There's another character who is struggling with his sexuality, um, and I'm so curious in terms of the views, in terms of how it's perceived and how people would perceive that, because it seems
yeah,
like, oh, we can't talk about this.
yeah. So I'm going to start with that, and then I'll work my way back to Bev.
Sure. Yeah.
So I don't know how things have changed now that we're in a more, modern day and age. But when I was growing up in the county, it was the 90s, and you did not talk about sexuality of any sort, be it straight, gay, anything. Um,
I thought that was just being a wasp in my family.
yeah. But I think part of it is a New England mentality. We
Mm,
kind of are famous for not necessarily talking about everything.
mhm.
But I think part of it is because Rustic is so isolated, it's very much its own world. It's very working class. That it just didn't, I don't know. There's just like this culture of silence up there where you might know your neighbor is gay, but you're not going to talk about it. Um, I also know that there were people growing up in the decades before me who were really mistreated because people knew they were gay.
Mm.
Um, so I just wanted to explore in through fiction how it would be for these two women, Bev and Trudy, to be living in an environment like that, where on one hand you have a super supportive community and everyone knows everyone, and on the other hand you have these really complex issues that no one talks about. And originally, like at the very beginning, Bev and Trudy were just good friends. And I thought maybe one of them might have feelings for the other, but that didn't feel right. But then Trudy and Bev, but Trudy to a much louder degree, started telling me, like, Bev is my lady. Like, you got to
Mm.
just write it. You just like write us as a couple. And it just felt so natural that they would be more than friends. And they're just soulmates on this level that goes even beyond like an issue of sexuality. They're just meant
Sure.
for each other. Um, I just love every scene with them together is just, even if they're going through a tough time, it's so joyful to write a scene with them together. You know, I loved this scene in the first book where they're at the bar and they're kind of like saying F you to the town, and they're finally dancing together in front of
Yep.
everybody. And it was just, I just, they're they're the best. They're amazing. I love them so much. I'm so glad that I explored that little voice, that I listened to Trudy and I wrote into their relationship.
I am too.
Yeah.
But I'm so fascinated at the quartet, meaning
Mhm.
the relationships with their husbands.
Yes. Yeah.
And that really digs much deeper
Yeah.
in this book, and it all makes sense. It really does. And that's what I find. It doesn't make anything easy, but it smacks very true to real life,
Hmm.
which is, look, at there are different levels and different points on a curve of relationships.
Definitely. So to speak to that, in the second book, um, and it's not really a spoiler, in the second book, Trudy's husband, Richard, has a heart attack. And so she has to divert a lot of her attention to caring for him. And that kind of calls into question not only her relationship with Bev, she doesn't have as much time to spend with her, but her relationship with Richard. And in the first book, I think you got glimpses of the fact that Richard and Trudy still really care for each other,
Mhm, mhm.
but it's definitely strained. In the second book, I feel like they come to, I mean, I know they come to a place of acceptance, and it was really nice to see that Richard, in with all of his flaws, and he does have flaws even though he's a great character, he accepts Trudy for who she is. And they come to a point where they can kind of talk about it. Whereas Bev is married to a good man as well, but he is much more part of that culture of not talking about anything. But Bev and Bill also love each other in their own way. You know, they're firm in their parenting of Nate, and now that they're grandparents, you know, so there are different levels of different relationships. It's not always romantic, it's not always true love, but it can be it can still be a healthy-ish relationship in its way.
Yeah.
It can still work somehow.
Well, and I've known people like this.
Yeah,
I for whatever reason, and so they're out there. They
yeah,
exist, and it's not always for anyone to understand it,
right.
except for the two people who are actually in it.
Exactly. Yeah,
Um, but it's nice to see the nuances play out, and it's nice to
yeah.
see that, okay, this isn't just one thing.
Right. Right. Nothing is just one thing. There's always layers and complexities.
Now, have you heard? I'm sure so many people have in town have read this. How is their reaction to these characters?
Everyone I've talked to love Bev and Trudy. And it seems like everyone kind of identifies with what you're talking about, that they're understanding that these two marriages only have to make sense to the people who live in them.
Sure.
So I've had a very positive reaction to Bev and Trudy, which has been so heartwarming, and so it makes me feel like not not everything is hopeless.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
hear you. I
Yeah.
also think you're basing a relationship, what you're focusing on is their connectedness and
Yeah.
their love for each other.
Yep.
This is not like you're writing some spicy sapphic.
No, definitely
It's
not.
really, and I think that resonates and can resonate more with people
Yeah.
because they understand how deep rooted this really is.
Exactly. It's just like I think any solid relationship is grounded in friendship and just you have to love being together.
Yeah.
And they love being together, whether it's cataloging books at the library or having a couple cocktails at the bar. They just genuinely love each other's company.
Um, I just had a side note question, completely separate. Annette,
Hmm.
who was Bridget's mom
Yes.
from the first book, and she comes to the forefront a little bit more in this book. And one of the things she does is spends a lot of time on the Home Shopping Network, which the only time I've ever seen this addressed anywhere is in Reality Bites with Winona Ryder. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie. Have you ever seen
No,
it?
no.
Okay, Winona Ryder is
I like
literally
Winona.
just
Yeah.
like placid in front of a television and just ordering stuff. Like, and you just see like the reflection from the television in her
Yeah.
face. Have you ever done this? Have you ever gotten anything from the Home Shopping Network?
No, but I grew up in that era where like those sorts of commercials were
All the
always on
time.
TV. Like,
Yes.
what was his name? Billy Mays.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those were big in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I've watched a lot of TV in my life. I'm not ashamed to say it. And so I was aware that these things existed. And I just thought, what would it be like if someone actually ordered all those things? And on a deeper level, why would somebody be compelled to order all of those things?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in Annette's case, it's really, really sad. You know, she's not coping with her grief. And, you know, as a way to deal with it, she's compulsively shopping and compulsively drinking. And so it was, on the surface, it sounds kind of funny, like all these products you can buy from TV, but really it's very sad what's happening to this character.
I laughed because I feel like had I had a credit card and was old enough at the time, I probably would have fallen into that trap.
Yeah.
Because I am certainly somebody who, like, during lockdown, I was the first person to like jump on a Kickstarter campaign,
Oh, yeah.
or like Instagram will always be like something will come up, and I'll be like, well, I'll just try that out. Like my
Yeah.
husband's always like, you are the king of the single use appliance. Stop ordering. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm like,
Yes,
but this will compact your garbage and makes, fertilizer for the roses or whatever.
exactly. Yes.
All right. So when you started this, did you always intend for it to go on, or were you literally just writing a book and you're like, I have more to say?
I always knew it was going to be bigger than the first book. Um, you know, in the first book, there's certainly a lot of things left unresolved at the end. So the second book kind of it doesn't. There's still not a lot of resolution in the second. I've always known that Dalton, as much as I needed to leave my hometown, I still can't stop writing about it, even though I'm 35. I feel like I got out when I was 19 and I'm still there. And I feel like I'll always be there. And
Sure.
so this is a good time to say I have sold the third book to Europa.
Yeah.
Um, I don't want to give the title away just yet until it's out on Publishers Marketplace because it's just a
Sure.
little. But in my mind, that trilogy wraps up this set of stories. However, I will always leave the door open to go back into Dalton maybe in a different time period, whether that's more modern or maybe, back in the day. I
Mm.
just feel like as we had mentioned earlier, there's endless stories in this tiny little town. And lots of times the things I'm most excited to explore a little deeper is I'll just write a name in a scene, like as a secondary character, like, oh, there's Helen McGreevy driving her Pinto
Sure.
around town, and I'll just wonder, what's her story? Like, what could I do with that? And so I feel like I've set myself up for endless possibilities, which is wonderful, but also a little overwhelming because I don't know how to choose one lane and stay in it. Yeah.
Well, maybe you're a freeway.
There you go. Yeah.
Do you do you view yourself as an old soul?
Oh yeah. I am an old lady through and through. I might be 35, well, almost 35, but I feel like 87 most of the time. And part of that is no doubt the trauma that I went through as a little kid. Because, like, from the time I understood anything, I knew that, like, I could die at any second. That's a pretty heavy thing for a 6 year old.
Of course.
Um, but I've always just felt much more connected to older people, hence my husband, who's like 25 years older than me. Um, I've always
So
liked,
he and I are like the same age.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I've always liked older
Not
music.
older, just a little more seasoned.
Exactly. I don't know. I've just always felt not in touch with my actual age group or generation. I feel like I feel very, very seasoned.
Well, no, and I ask that question primarily because, um, in particular, your seasoned characters are so well wrought and they're
Yeah.
so well thought out, and the way they relate to each other, it's like both you and Claire Lombardo are roughly the same age. I think you're
Hmm.
exactly the same age.
Hmm.
And I was shocked talking to Claire that she was also, as young as she was, writing these characters who were so much older and dealing with these things. So when I read this, like the first time I saw your photo, I was like, oh, she's a child.
Yeah. I look younger than my age, which is a
which
little,
is which
yeah,
is yeah, which
great,
is
but it's also
wonderful, and take it. But no, but you there's such a maturity about these people that you're writing about, and
Mhm.
it's really impressive.
Thank you.
uh
I appreciate that. Part of it
yeah.
was growing up in that small town, I was around older people all the time. So, like, when my mom would go visit her friend and have coffee, I went along with her. So I was kind
Mm.
of able to eavesdrop into these adult conversations and understand adults in a way that I didn't always understand people my own age, which was an interesting experience, would say.
I think a lot of people feel that. I mean, I grew up the same way with, I've all and my husband is 7 years older than I am, so
Yep.
I've always generated to older people as well.
Yeah.
I find as I've gotten older, I enjoy young people. I
Yeah.
enjoy their it's like, I enjoy the young people, but it's the exuberance, it's the youth,
They're,
it's looking at things differently.
yeah.
All their energy, look at them go.
Look at their
But I
technology.
that's exactly right. Wait, how do I forward this email?
Yeah.
but but no, so I totally get that. I
Yeah.
totally understand. I want to read this. I'm being conscious of the time, and I know we're about to close out, but I want to read a quote from your book that comes towards the end, and just want your thoughts on it, which is, why go somewhere else when everything you need is right here?
Hmm. Yeah. So that is from Vera and her parents because her parents have said that. And we talked about them a little bit earlier that they're so content in this small little world that they've created for themselves. And I think that there's something to be said for that. You know, as much as I feel like I wouldn't want to go live my hometown again, I do feel like where I live now, I've created that own little content world for myself. And I feel
Mm.
like sometimes we put too much emphasis on imagining what else we could have if we went somewhere else. I think that there's something to be said for creating a cozy little life full of simple things and just treasuring it. So I feel like when that quote kind of came up once and then again. I felt like that was very evocative of a lot of characters probably feel the same way about Dalton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the readers too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this was just delightful. You are just a delight.
Thank you so much.
Um, thank you so much. I'm so excited for you. Everyone that's I know that's read it so far has absolutely loved it. And